If you are looking for unique Easter basket ideas for a girl with minimal candy and more of an arts and craft feel, then this video is for you. Keep on watching. Welcome back and happy Easter. And if it's your first time, I suggest you subscribe right now. Let's get straight to the basket. This basket is for my baby girl, Drew, a daughter from another mother. I also have to shout out my niece as well, Amani, because I know she's watching right now. So let's get back to the basket. I just want to show you all the amazing things that I put in this basket. They're sparkly, they're bright, they are for a girl. The theme is LOL, surprise. As you can see, I have two bright, cute masks that I got from the 99-cent store. Also, the first 3 glitter star glues I also got from the 99-cent store. Everything else was from the Dollar Tree. They have amazing things, beautiful, fun stuff for girls. If you go to the Dollar Tree, you will have a blast. From beautiful bunny glasses to surprise lip gloss, bubblegum balm, crystal light up putty, nail polish, hair products, and amazing activities that I had to get. They also have silly scent Play-Doh, regular Play-Doh, I mean you name it. I had to put all of these fun things in this basket, so you don't understand the fun that I had. I just want you to understand that if you go into the Dollar Tree, you will be broke because the amount of products that they have in there is great. So I picked up beautiful Easter signs and also 3 different egg decorating kits. That's a must. Make sure you choose items that they would like and make sure you have fun while you make this. I had a blast creating this basket and I suggest you stay tuned to the end so that you can see the transformation. See you soon. So now that we know what's in the basket, I want to show you how I actually created my basket. I used a gold file bin from the Dollar Tree and I built it up to create my own basket. So for starters, I cut a 12" by 8.5" piece so that I can place that on the bottom of my basket so that nothing falls through the basket. Then I cut 3 pieces of 12 by 1.75" pieces. I glued those together and created my own platform. I used skewer sticks to push them through the platform and into the back of the basket so that it will create a more sturdier basket. I then used cable ties to connect my basket to the back board. All I did was cut 2 holes and place my cable ties through and into the basket. I tightened them for double support. When you do this, you guys, make sure you're gentle because if you tie it too tight, it will break through the form. Good luck. So you guys, tell me in the comments below if you're digging my basket so far. I know it's a lot. Some people do not like to do the most with their baskets, but when I do a basket, I like to go all the way with it. As you can see, my basket is really tall. It's 22.5 inches tall and 13.5 inches wide. So this is a big baby right here. So I like to go big or go home. So you guys, you can do this basket. You can get anything you want to place in your basket. Make sure it's fun, make sure it's bright, and make sure they will love it. I know she's gonna love it because the majority of the things in there is the things she loves to do. So have fun with this basket. Enjoy yourself. Do not get discouraged because it's huge. You can do it. And if you're not subscribed by now, I mean, come on. I have a pink circle on the bottom of the screen, on the right side of the screen, so that it's easier for you to subscribe. So press that button and you will be able to subscribe right now. And if you want to follow me on Instagram, my Instagram handle is Sharon_creative_studio. So I will definitely see you over there. And to further continue with this basket, I moved a lot of things in the basket around. I fiddled with it. You're going to do the same because you're going to look at it and say, no, I want to put it on this side. I want to put it on that side. So whatever way looks good for you, go ahead and do your thing. I also make sure I put things on the side of the basket so that when the basket turns, it still looks appealing. I use a skewer to build up the side of the basket so it can hold up the side of the basket and it doesn't fall to the side. Then I place this beautiful bunny sign, Easter bunny sign, on the back of my basket, which looks great, bright, and cute. I taped it to the back and also placed my LOL surprise mask on both sides of the gift basket. I want you guys to let me know how you think this basket is coming along. I enjoyed it. I love it. But please let me know in the comments what you think. I'm so excited. Just looking at this basket just brings a smile to my face. So I know she is going to be cheesing from ear to ear. So to continue, I cut some cute pink Easter looking flowers to place on the top corners of my basket, and as you can see, I also placed them on the bottom rim of the basket and put a little pieces in there just for a little fun. So yeah, look at this basket. I mean, come on, you cannot tell me this basket is not dope. So we're getting close to the end of the video, but we're not at the end, so do not go anywhere. I'm placing my basket into the cellophane pocket. This one is an extra large. I will put the dimensions in the description below and the name brand, so if you want to buy it, you'll be able to buy it. I will put the extra large one as well as the medium size one so that you can choose the one that is best for you. So in previous videos, I showed you how to use cellophane and how to wrap it with cellophane. So if you want to do it that way, you can go to that video and you can learn how to do that. But this video, I wanted to try something new and I wanted to look a little more neater. So I used shrink wrap, which when you use a blow dryer or a heat gun, it will shrink the basket so that everything ties together neat and tight. Just make sure on the sides of the basket you do not, make it too tight where all the things are pushing to the center. As you can see, I did it on the sides of the basket a little bit, but it still looks good. So don't kill yourself. It's not that serious. It's beautiful regardless. If you put your heart into it, I promise you will be happy with your product. So there you go. What do you think? Okay, so we are putting our final touches on our gift basket, our Easter gift basket. I love it so far. Let me know what you think. I just want to put the ribbon on it and curl it up just to give it a little cute pop. Then put my little pink bow on top, and I mean, voila, our basket is done. So let me know in the comments below if you will try this. See you soon. I hope this video was helpful and gave you some ideas on what you can put in your gift basket. I hope you had fun with me and will give this a try. Like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Comment below and tell me what you think. And don't forget, Happy Easter! See you later!